Imagine a Europe not of fairy tales or chivalry, but of smoke, iron, and prayer, a continent ruled by silence and fear, where the toll of a single church bell could decide life or death. For centuries, this world seemed eternal, a divine machine built by God himself. Kings ruled by holy right, lords ruled by sword and tax, and peasants obeyed because the church told them heaven was only for the humble. But what if I told you that the system everyone believed was divinely unbreakable was already dying from within, that the Middle Ages, that age of knights, castles, and crusades, was not a golden era, but a slow collapse disguised as faith? Backhand index pointing right, micro hook, and the signs of its fall were everywhere, hidden in plain sight. The pyramid of power. At the top stood kings crowned by priests, believing themselves the chosen guardians of order. Beneath them, nobles and knights, sworn to protect the land and themselves. And at the base, the millions who toiled in dirt and hunger, peasants who worked the land, paid the taxes, and died forgotten. To keep this order alive, one thing was needed above all else: belief. Belief that this suffering was sacred. Belief that obedience was holy. Belief that questioning the system was rebellion against God. But belief, like gold, can be corrupted. And in the heart of Europe, corruption had already taken root. Backhand index pointing right, micro hook. Because when faith becomes profit, even salvation can be sold. The seeds of decay. By the year 1200, Europe's population had exploded. Forests were cut, fields exhausted, villages spread across every valley. More mouths to feed, but not enough bread. The soil, once rich and generous, began to fail. And as the harvest shrank, the taxes grew. Feudal lords demanded more grain, more labor, more obedience. Knights drained villages to fund wars that meant nothing to those who fought them. The same peasants who built cathedrals now starved beneath their shadows. Rumors began to spread of famine, of injustice, of divine punishment. Yet, instead of mercy, the church demanded more tithes, more offerings. Because even hunger could be profitable if you promise redemption in return. The Holy Empire of Fear. By the early 14th century, the church was not just a spiritual force. It was the largest landowner in Europe. Its priests spoke of humility while living in palaces gilded with gold. Faith had turned into a currency. Salvation had a price tag. And the people, desperate, afraid, hungry, began to notice. They didn't dare rebel, not yet, but doubt had entered the bloodstream of the Middle Ages. A quiet, dangerous doubt. Backhand index pointing right, micro hook. Because when people stop fearing hell, the entire world order begins to shake. Even kings were no longer safe from the church's shadow. Popes crowned emperors and excommunicated them when they disobeyed. God's representatives on earth now ruled not from the altar, but from the throne. The holy and the profane had become one. And whenever faith and power become one, history writes the same ending, the whisper of collapse. Across Europe, the omens multiplied. Skies darkened for months. Crops failed. Merchants vanished on roads infested with bandits and wolves. Villages were swallowed by silence. But no one called it collapse. They called it God's will. When lightning struck a church tower, it was a sign of sin. When children starved, it was punishment for disbelief. People knelt and prayed harder, while the very ground beneath them began to rot. Backhand index pointing right, micro hook. But heaven was silent, and what came instead was death itself. The priest said, "Endure and you'll reach paradise." The noble said, "Obey and you'll be protected." But both promises would soon crumble together, because from the east a black wind was rising, invisible, relentless, and it carried something Europe had never faced before. Not an army, not a rebellion, but the end of an age, foreshadowing the fall. By 1345, rumors whisper of entire villages emptied overnight, of ships drifting ashore with no crew alive, of bodies stacked higher than city walls. No one knew what it was. No one could stop it. But deep inside, the people of Europe already knew. They had lived their lives under fear, under power, under silence. And now that silence would consume them all. Backhand index pointing right, micro hook. And teaser for part 2. The Black Death was not just a plague. It was the executioner of the Middle Ages. And as the bells tolled one last time, Europe stepped into its darkest night. The year was 1347. A merchant ship from the east docked at the port of Messina, Sicily. The crew never spoke, because they were already dead. Their cargo was not gold, nor silk, nor spices. It was death itself. Backhand index pointing right, micro hook, and within months, the very heartbeat of Europe began to fade. The Black Death spread faster than words could travel. A breath, a touch, a single flea, and the curse passed on. Cities locked their gates, villages burned their sick, priests abandoned their churches, and brothers abandoned their brothers. No army could stop it. No prayer could slow it. It moved like a living shadow, swallowing kingdoms and faith alike. By the time the bells fell silent, 1 out of every 2 souls in Europe was gone. Entire families erased. Entire towns reduced to ghosts. But the plague did more than kill people. It killed belief, the collapse of faith. For centuries, the church had promised protection, salvation, divine order. But the priests died just like the peasants. The bishops prayed and bled. The Pope himself fled to safety behind stone walls while the streets filled with corpses. And the people began to ask the question no one dared before. If God is merciful, why has he abandoned us? Backhand index pointing right, micro hook. That single question shattered 1,000 years of obedience. Faith cracked like old marble. Where once there were hymns, now there were screams. Where there was worship, now there was rage. The peasants turned against the priests. The priests turned against each other. Flagellants roamed the land, whipping their backs until blood ran, trying to prove to heaven that they were still worthy. But heaven did not answer. And when faith dies, something else must take its place. The rise of rebellion. Out of the ashes of despair, a new thought was born. We don't need their God to survive. Peasants who had once bowed now lifted their heads. They had buried their lords, their priests, their kings, and still they lived. And in survival, they found something forbidden: power. Across Europe, the social pyramid began to crumble. The plague had killed the laborers, and now the survivors were rare and valuable. For the first time, peasants had to demand wages. Landowners begged them to work their fields. And when the nobles refused to pay, villages rebelled. Backhand index pointing right, micro hook. The world built on obedience was starting to remember how to say no. The peasants' revolt in England, the Jacquerie in France, the Ciampi uprising in Florence. Each rebellion lit a fire in the heart of the Middle Ages, a fire that could no longer be contained, the war that never ended. But the plague was only the beginning, as if the earth itself wanted to erase the old world. War followed pestilence like thunder follows lightning. The 100 Years' War turned Europe into a graveyard. King fought king. Knight slaughtered knight. Villages burned in the name of crowns that no one would remember. Once, war had been the pride of the nobles, a dance of honor and banners. Now it was chaos. Gunpowder replaced chivalry. Cannon fire tore through castle walls that had stood for centuries. And the knights, once the gods of the battlefield, became relics of another age. Backhand index pointing right, micro hook. Steel and faith were no longer enough. The Middle Ages had met its match, technology. Every fortress fell. Every holy symbol cracked. The war devoured everything: gold, faith, and youth. And when it was over, Europe was no longer medieval. It was something else, something darker, colder, more human. The unraveling of feudal power. When death took half of Europe, it also took the illusion that lords were chosen by heaven. If nobility could die like anyone else, then maybe they were never divine at all. Peasants stopped bowing. Soldiers stopped praying. And the word freedom, once whispered in fear, was now spoken out loud. Monarchs clung to their thrones. The church tried to rebuild its influence, but the people had seen too much. They had touched the end of the world and survived. Backhand index pointing right, micro hook. Transition teaser to part 3. Yet, even as faith burned and kings fell, something new was being born. a spark in the darkness that would change everything. The plague had destroyed the old order, but in the ruins, humanity was beginning to awaken. The Black Death had burned across Europe like a storm from another world. It left behind more than graves. It left questions, and questions are more dangerous than any plague, because when people begin to ask why, power begins to tremble. Backhand index pointing right, micro hook. And for the first time in 1,000 years, people dare to look at God and not bow. New moon, the silence before the dawn. The silence that followed the plague was unlike any other. No laughter, no prayers, no singing from cathedrals. Only wind through empty streets and bells tolling for the dead. But in that silence, something extraordinary happened. People began to listen, not to priests, not to kings, but to themselves. Across Europe, the survivors of the old world began to rebuild, not from faith, but from reason. They looked at the ruins of cathedrals and asked, why did this happen? What have we learned? What if we can create something new? Backhand index pointing right, micro hook. And from those ruins, a new kind of faith was born, not in heaven, but in humanity. In monasteries that once copied psalms, monks began copying the forgotten texts of Greece and Rome. The words of Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, voices that had been silent for over 1,000 years, were whispering again. The ancient world, thought to be dead, was speaking through the parchment of the Middle Ages, and its message was simple. Think. Fire the rebirth of curiosity. In the merchant cities of Italy, Florence, Venice, Genoa, a new kind of power was rising. Money, not blood. Families like the Medici funded art instead of armies. Their wealth built not castles, but cathedrals of imagination. Painters no longer painted saints with empty faces. They painted men and women real, flawed, alive. They discovered perspective, and with it, rediscovered the human soul. Backhand index pointing right, micro hook. Every brushstroke was rebellion, and every painting a declaration of freedom. The church, still powerful, tried to claim this rebirth as its own, but it was too late. Art had escaped the altar. Knowledge had escaped the monastery. And truth had escaped their control. Astronomers lifted their eyes to the night sky and saw order, not mystery. Mathematicians measured what had once been called divine. Inventors turned dreams into machines. And every discovery chipped away at the old foundation of fear. Kindled the fire of thought. The Renaissance wasn't peace. It was a war of ideas. Every invention, every poem, every book was a battlefield. On one side, faith, tradition, control. On the other, reason, art, and the dangerous belief that man could shape his own destiny. Backhand index pointing right, micro hook. And this war would change not just Europe, but the entire story of civilization. In Florence, Leonardo da Vinci studied anatomy, not to glorify God, but to understand life itself. In Germany, Gutenberg created a machine that multiplied knowledge faster than priests could silence it. The printing press spread more than ink. It spread freedom. One book could now reach 1,000 eyes. One idea could now travel farther than any army. The monopoly on truth was broken forever. And as knowledge flowed like a river, Europe began to awaken, slowly, painfully, beautifully. Sunrise, the end of fear. But the old world did not die quietly. The church struck back. Inquisitions burned thinkers alive. Books were banned, heretics hunted, minds censored. But ideas are like seeds. The more you try to bury them, the deeper they grow. In the universities of Paris, Oxford, and Bologna, students debated philosophy not as servants of dogma, but as seekers of truth. In Germany, a monk named Martin Luther dared to challenge the church itself, nailing his 95 theses to a door and splitting Christendom in half. Backhand index pointing right, micro hook. The Reformation didn't just divide religion, it divided history. Luther's rebellion wasn't only spiritual, it was psychological. It told every man and woman, you have the right to think for yourself. That single idea would ignite revolutions centuries later. It was the spark that set the modern world ablaze. Sparkles the light returns. By 1453, Constantinople, the last flame of the ancient empire, fell to the Ottomans. But with its fall came an unexpected gift. Scholars fled west carrying the wisdom of Byzantium, philosophy, astronomy, medicine, art. And suddenly, the Western world had more than faith to live for. It had knowledge. Explorers like Columbus and Magellan sailed into the unknown seas, not to spread religion, but to chase curiosity. Artists like Michelangelo turned marble into emotion. Writers like Dante, Petrarch, and Shakespeare made words immortal. The Middle Ages had been ruled by fear of death. The Renaissance was driven by the hunger to live. Backhand index pointing right, micro hook, final transition. But as light returned to the world, one question still echoed through every cathedral and every palace. Did we truly escape the darkness, or just give a new name? The rebirth of knowledge had begun, but the shadow of power still lingered, waiting for its next empire to rise. The Middle Ages did not end in one day. They ended in all of us, slowly, quietly, one belief at a time. And those centuries have passed. The shadows of that world still linger in our own. Backhand index pointing right, micro hook. Because the fall of the medieval world was not just history, it was a warning. Candle echoes of the old world. Look around today, at the cities we build, the systems we obey, the hierarchies we still protect. We like to believe we're free from superstition, that reason rules where faith once did. But the truth is, every era creates its own gods. Once they were saints and kings. Today, they are power, fame, and control. We've replaced cathedrals with skyscrapers and thrones with boardrooms. But the structure remains the same. The few rule the many, and most still kneel without knowing why. Backhand index pointing right, micro hook. History doesn't repeat itself. It hides behind new names. Gear the chains we still carry. In the Middle Ages, peasants worked the land they would never own. Today, millions work lives they will never live. Back then, ignorance was the weapon of control. Now it's distraction. The church sold salvation. We sell perfection. The kings claim divine right. Today's rulers claim data, science, profit. Different words. Same faith and power. Backhand index pointing right. Micro hook. The medieval world never truly died. It just learned to wear a suit. Sunrise the fire that survived. And yet, something from that dark age survived. Something purer. Not the castles, not the crowns, but the courage of those who question it all. The monk who dared to read forbidden books. The peasant who refused to bow again. The woman who looked at the stars and wondered why. They were the sparks that carried us forward, and we are their descendants. Backhand index pointing right, micro hook. The same fire that burned to the dark ages still burns in you. Because every time you think for yourself, you are rebelling against 1,000 years of silence. Every time you refuse to kneel to fear, you are finishing the revolution they began. The fall of the Middle Ages was not an ending. It was a transfer of light. From the hands of the few to the minds of the many sparkles the legacy. The cathedrals may have crumbled, but their stones still whisper the story of a world that dared to begin again. A world that learned, painfully, that no empire, no faith, no crown lasts forever. And maybe that's the lesson, that every civilization, no matter how strong, eventually faces its own night. But in every night, there's someone who keeps the candle burning. Backhand index pointing right, micro hook, closing loop. And as long as that candle survives, the Middle Ages never truly end. So if this story made you think, if it reminded you that history isn't just dates and kings, but choices, fear, and courage, then subscribe to this channel. Because the past isn't dead. It's waiting to be understood. And every story we tell here is another light against the darkness. Stay curious, stay awake, and remember, the greatest empires don't fall in battle. They fall in silence.